Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, champions in the making, let me ask you a question that cuts straight to the soul of your walk with God. Jesus did not abolish the Sabbath. He fulfilled it. That distinction is critical. There's a common misunderstanding that when Jesus came, he wiped the slate clean, removed the commandments, and introduced something entirely new. But Jesus himself said in Matthew 5:17, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them." Fulfillment doesn't mean cancellation. Fulfillment means completion, the bringing of a thing to its full expression. When Jesus fulfilled the Sabbath, he didn't end it. He revealed its deepest meaning. He took what was a shadow and brought the substance. The Sabbath wasn't erased. It was embodied in him. The Sabbath is not merely a day. It's a divine rhythm established from the very beginning of creation. When God created the heavens and the earth in 6 days and rested on the seventh, he wasn't tired. God doesn't get tired. He rested because he was finished. The rest was not for him. It was a model for us. It was built into the fabric of creation, not as a suggestion, but as a spiritual principle. In a world addicted to productivity and performance, the Sabbath stands as a declaration. We are not machines. We are children of God. God established a rhythm, 6 days of creation to 1 day of rest, to remind us that rest is not a reward for work. It is the foundation of it. When Jesus lived and taught among the people, the religious leaders of the time accused him of breaking the Sabbath because he healed and helped people on that day. But he wasn't breaking the law. He was revealing its original purpose. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. He was showing us that the Sabbath was never meant to be a burden. It was meant to be a blessing. While the Pharisees enforced the form, Jesus restored the function. His actions on the Sabbath were not violations. They were validations of its deeper truth, that freedom, healing, and restoration are at the very core of God's design for rest. Today, too many believers treat the Sabbath as either a forgotten relic or a restrictive rule. But that's not how God intended it. The Sabbath is a covenant, not a constraint. It's a prophetic declaration that God is our source. By pausing, by ceasing from striving, we are saying, God, I trust you more than I trust my own labor. That's why keeping the Sabbath is not about legalism. It's about lordship. Who's really running your life? Who do you believe provides for you? Who do you believe sustains you? The Sabbath confronts the illusion of self-sufficiency and invites us back into dependence on God. Rest, as defined by God, is not weakness. It's wisdom. When we rest according to his pattern, we're not being lazy, we're being strategic. There's a divine advantage that comes from honoring God's design. In fact, rest is one of the most powerful forms of warfare. When everyone else is burning out trying to keep up, those who obey God's rhythm are being refreshed, refocused, and realigned. While the world glorifies the hustle, God blesses the holy pause. It is not in your constant motion that you find favor. It is in your obedience that favor is released. Jesus did not diminish the Sabbath. He magnified it. He brought it out of the shadows of tradition and into the light of revelation. He became the embodiment of rest for the weary. But make no mistake, just because Jesus is our rest does not mean the principle of the Sabbath is obsolete. Just as grace does not nullify the call to holiness, the rest we find in Christ does not eliminate our need to follow God's rhythms. Spiritual rest in Christ and physical rest in obedience go hand in hand. Ignoring the Sabbath principle is not just neglect, it's disobedience wrapped in business. There is a spiritual power that is released when we honor the Sabbath. It is not just about taking a break. It's about making a declaration. It's about saying, I don't need to strive every single day to be enough. God has already made me enough. When we honor the Sabbath, we step into God's economy where time is redeemed, strength is renewed, and provision is multiplied. It is a moment where we stop working for approval and start working from approval. When you rest in alignment with God's will, the work you do outside that rest becomes far more fruitful. The Sabbath is not a relic of the past. It is a revelation for the present. Jesus did not abolish it because it was never meant to be abolished. He revealed its purpose so we could walk in the fullness of it. In a world that tells you to go faster, push harder, and never stop, the Sabbath invites you to slow down, trust deeper, and rest in the completed work of God. It's not about religion. It's about relationship. It's not about rules. It's about rhythm. And when you find that rhythm, you find grace, clarity, peace, and a kind of strength that can only come from divine rest. The Sabbath is not merely a day off or a religious observance. It is a divine rhythm embedded in the very structure of creation. Before there was sin, before there were nations, before there were even commandments written on stone, there was the Sabbath. On the seventh day, God did something that set a precedent for humanity, not because he was weary, but because he was wise. He ceased from all his work to model a truth life is not meant to be a nonstop grind. The Sabbath is not man's invention. It is God's idea, God's pattern, God's rhythm. It is woven into the fabric of time. And when we step out of it, we're not just getting tired. We're misaligned with the Creator's design. God worked for 6 days and rested on the seventh, not out of necessity, but out of intentionality. That divine pause was a declaration, not of fatigue, but of fulfillment. Everything was in its place, and God looked over all that he had made and called it very good. Then he sanctified that seventh day. He made it holy. This wasn't just the end of a week. It was the beginning of a principle. The Sabbath isn't a ceremonial duty. It's a declaration that there is a time to stop, reflect, realign, and recognize that life doesn't come from our hustle, but from our connection to the source. It was always meant to bless mankind, not burden him. When people reject the Sabbath in favor of continual productivity, they're not just breaking a rule, they're violating a rhythm that was never meant to be optional. In the same way gravity holds the universe in place, the Sabbath holds your soul in balance. It is the place where we step out of the rat race and into a higher space, a space of faith, trust, and surrender. Observing the Sabbath is not about inactivity. It's about intentional rest that restores. It is a divine reminder that while we are called to work, we are not slaves to it. We are not defined by what we do. We are defined by who we belong to. In the culture of today, where business is equated with significance and exhaustion, is worn like a badge of honor, the Sabbath stands as a bold contradiction. It says, you don't have to earn rest. You were created with it in mind. The Sabbath was given to protect us from the tyranny of overwork and the illusion of control. In honoring the Sabbath, we affirm that we are not the source of our own provision. God is. And in stepping back one day a week, we're not falling behind. We're catching up with the will of heaven. We are aligning our life with the Creator's design, which is always the path of least resistance and the greatest effectiveness. This rhythm was never intended to be a burden. A legalism turned it into one. That's what Jesus confronted when he healed on the Sabbath, not to nullify the principle, but to free people from the prison of man-made interpretations. The religious leaders turned the Sabbath into a system of do's and don'ts forgetting its original purpose to refresh the soul, to renew the body, and to reconnect with God. Jesus, by healing on the Sabbath, wasn't rejecting the day. He was redeeming its true meaning. He was showing that doing good, restoring life, and honoring God go hand in hand with resting in Him. The Sabbath is not only about physical rest, it's about spiritual realignment. It repositions our heart to remember who God is and who we are in Him. It reminds us that we are not orphans trying to survive by our own strength, but sons and daughters of a God who supplies every need. In our ceasing from work, we proclaim that our security comes from His hand, not our own. In this space of holy rest, pride dies, fear loses its grip, and peace becomes our portion. The Sabbath trains us to trust, not just in theory, but in practice. Because to stop working even for a day in a performance-driven culture is an act of radical faith. Everything about the Sabbath opposes the culture of self-made success. The world says, keep going, never stop, don't fall behind. But the Sabbath says, cease, reflect, worship, renew. It is a built-in discipline that reminds us that the God who governs the universe does not need our nonstop effort to keep the world spinning. If God can run the cosmos without our input for one day, then surely we can rest. When we refuse to rest, we're essentially saying we trust our effort more than His sovereignty. But when we honor the Sabbath, we are saying, God, You're the one who sustains, not me. Many people miss the blessing of the Sabbath because they treat it as a burden or a relic. But the reality is, it is one of the most powerful spiritual tools we've been given to recalibrate our life. It was never about inactivity. It was always about intimacy, a space carved out in time for communion with God, for clarity of mind, and for restoration of soul. When we understand this, we begin to see the Sabbath not as a requirement, but as a reward, not something we have to do, but something we get to do. It becomes a sacred pause in the rush of life that restores power, perspective, and purpose. When Jesus was accused of breaking the Sabbath by the religious leaders of His time, the accusation wasn't truly about what He was doing. It was about what they misunderstood. They were so focused on the letter of the law that they missed the spirit behind it. In their minds, healing was work, and work was forbidden. But Jesus didn't view the Sabbath through the lens of legalism. He viewed it through the lens of liberty. He understood the heart of God behind the commandment that the Sabbath was made for man's benefit, not to enslave him to religious ritual. His acts of mercy weren't violations. They were revelations. He was pulling back the curtain on God's true intention for the Sabbath. The healing of the man with the withered hand, the deliverance of the woman bent over for 18 years, and the restoration of the sick, all performed on the Sabbath, weren't just miracles. They were messages. Messages that the Sabbath is a day for life to be restored, for dignity to be returned, for burdens to be lifted. These weren't just kind gestures from a compassionate teacher. They were prophetic acts that redefined how we understand rest. Because true rest isn't the absence of motion. It's the presence of restoration. It's not inactivity. It's the power of God at work in the midst of surrender. The Sabbath was never meant to restrict what God could do. It was meant to reflect what God had already done. When Jesus healed on the Sabbath, He wasn't desecrating it, He was demonstrating it. He was embodying the purpose of the Sabbath, which is to bring wholeness to every part of our being. That's why He boldly declared Himself to be the Lord of the Sabbath, not the remover of it, not the replacer of it, but the Lord of it. He was saying, I am the source of true rest, the one who upholds the law in its fullest, deepest, most redemptive form. He was claiming authority over it, not to destroy it, but to perfect it. In each confrontation with the Pharisees, Jesus exposed the gap between religion and relationship. Religion imposes burdens that God never intended. Relationship brings revelation that sets people free. The Sabbath had become a system of rules so far removed from its original purpose that the people no longer saw it as a gift. They saw it as a threat. But Jesus stepped into that distortion and revealed the truth that God never gave the Sabbath to weigh people down. He gave it to lift them up. That's why acts of healing were not only appropriate on the Sabbath, they were essential because they reflected what the day was always meant to bring: life, renewal, freedom. The people who witnessed those Sabbath miracles weren't just seeing power, they were witnessing priority. Jesus prioritized people over policies, purpose over procedure, love over law. He wasn't dismissing the Sabbath commandment, he was fulfilling it by placing compassion at the center. It wasn't about doing nothing on the Sabbath. It was about doing the right things, things that align with the heart of God, things that refresh the soul, uplift the broken, and point the world back to the goodness of the Father. He brought clarity where there was confusion. He brought focus where there was fog. He brought light where there had been legalistic shadows. One of the most profound aspects of Jesus' Sabbath ministry is that it teaches us something fundamental about the character of God. He is not a taskmaster demanding perfect rule following. He is a father who desires wholeness for his children. Every healing on the Sabbath was a signpost pointing to this truth. It told the watching world that God doesn't pause his love. He doesn't clock out on mercy. He doesn't take a break from compassion. If anything, the Sabbath intensifies his engagement with us. It's a day when heaven draws near to restore what the world has drained. And Jesus operated fully within that truth, never contradicting it, only revealing its depths. Jesus never once said the Sabbath was obsolete. What he challenged was the distortion of it. He challenged the mindset that made it about rules instead of rest, about obligation instead of opportunity. He showed that the Sabbath was not about being frozen in fear of violating a command. It was about being freed to experience the fullness of God's provision. The legalists couldn't see that because their focus was on control, not on covenant. But Jesus came to restore the covenant perspective, that the Sabbath was meant to be life-giving, not life-limiting. And that in him, we don't cast the principle aside, we step into its truest form. What Jesus did on the Sabbath wasn't rebellion. It was revelation. He was revealing the deeper meaning that had been buried under centuries of tradition and human interpretation. He didn't diminish the commandment, he magnified its purpose. He showed us that in the kingdom of God, rest and restoration are not separate concepts. They are intimately connected. That's why the Sabbath remains a powerful tool for spiritual renewal today. Because when we follow Jesus' example, we don't just pause from activity, we participate in divine alignment. And that alignment brings clarity, strength, and healing to every part of our lives. Today, too many believers treat the Sabbath as either a forgotten relic of religious history or a rigid rule that no longer fits within the framework of grace. But when you strip away the layers of misunderstanding, what remains is a timeless truth rooted in the heart of God. The Sabbath was never designed to restrict us. It was designed to free us. It's not about limitation, it's about liberation. The same God who delivered Israel from Egyptian bondage included Sabbath rest in the 10 Commandments, not as a test of religious observance, but as a declaration of freedom. To stop working, to pause, to rest. That was a symbol of their deliverance, not a new kind of bondage. God did not just call his people out of physical slavery, he called them out of mental, emotional, and spiritual slavery as well. The Sabbath became a sign of that freedom. Imagine a people who were once forced to work without rest, being told by God himself, now, one day every week you will do no labor. That wasn't punishment, that was restoration. And even today, the same principle applies. The Sabbath is God's way of saying, you're not a slave to the clock. You're not a slave to the culture. You're not a slave to the grind. You belong to me, and I will take care of you. It was an act of divine kindness and a mark of spiritual identity. But over time, religion twisted what God meant to be a gift. The Sabbath became something people feared instead of something they looked forward to. Instead of a day of celebration and worship, it became a day filled with scrutiny and judgment. And that's exactly what Jesus came to confront. He wasn't breaking the Sabbath. He was breaking the man-made barriers that prevented people from entering into its true purpose. Healing someone on the Sabbath wasn't a contradiction to its meaning. It was the fulfillment of it. Because if the Sabbath is about restoration, then what could be more appropriate than restoring someone's health, dignity, or freedom? Jesus showed us that the Sabbath isn't just a commandment. It's a canvas for God's compassion. It's where grace meets rhythm. Every time Jesus healed on the Sabbath, he was declaring, this is what rest looks like. Not just laying still, but rising up healed. Not just doing nothing, but receiving everything. Not the absence of work, but the presence of wholeness. The religious leaders had locked the Sabbath in a cage of rules, but Jesus opened the door and set it free. And in doing so, he gave us a new picture, one not of restriction, but of restoration, one not of judgment, but of joy. Many people believe that honoring the Sabbath means going back to legalism, but nothing could be further from the truth. Honoring the Sabbath today doesn't mean keeping Old Testament customs with rigid precision. It means aligning our lives with the pattern and principle God laid out. It means taking God seriously when he says we need to rest. It means trusting that obedience to his rhythm is better than constant motion. In a world obsessed with hustle, the Sabbath is an act of spiritual resistance. It's a declaration that says, I refuse to find my value in how much I produce. My identity is not in my performance. It's in my position as a child of God. In that light, the Sabbath becomes more than just a day. It becomes a lifestyle. It becomes a holy rhythm that restores what life tries to steal. When Jesus healed, delivered, and taught on the Sabbath, he was showing us how to live in that rhythm. He was showing us the Sabbath is not about doing nothing. It's about doing the things that matter most. It's about resetting your spirit, recharging your mind, and reconnecting with your purpose. It's about creating space for God to move, speak, and strengthen you. That space is not wasted. It's sacred. It's not passive. It's powerful. The religious leaders of Jesus' time couldn't comprehend that kind of freedom. They were bound by tradition, unable to recognize the transformation standing right in front of them. But Jesus never backed down from their accusations. He stood in truth and demonstrated that true obedience is not found in rule following, but in purpose fulfilling. And the purpose of the Sabbath was always to bring life. That's why he said, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. He wasn't rewriting the law. He was revealing the law's heart, a heart that beats with mercy, justice, and rest for the weary. The Sabbath is not a ceremonial ritual to be checked off. It is a covenant reality to be walked in. It's a reminder that God still rules time, and when we align with his divine rhythm, we're not falling behind, We're moving forward with greater power. When Jesus engaged with the Sabbath, he didn't abolish its meaning. He amplified it. He made it clear that rest is not weakness, but wisdom. That pausing in God's presence is not laziness, but legacy. It's how we protect what matters, how we fuel our purpose, and how we remain rooted in the truth that it is not by might nor by power, but by his Spirit that we thrive. The Sabbath stands as one of the most profound principles God ever instituted for mankind, not because of what we are told to stop doing, but because of what we are invited to step into. It's more than a command, it's a covenant. From the beginning, God marked the seventh day, not because he was weary, but because he was wise. He knew that humanity would need more than productivity and progress. We would need presence, his presence. And so he built into the rhythm of time a sacred pause, a divine interruption where man could stop striving and start abetting. The Sabbath is not about inactivity, it's about intentionality. It's about creating space for divine realignment, for healing, for renewal, and for reconnection. When Jesus walked the earth, he walked in the fullness of the Spirit and the fullness of truth. He didn't come to set aside what the Father had established. He came to fulfill it, to reveal its true essence. And when it came to the Sabbath, he demonstrated that this holy day was not meant to chain people with fear, but to free them through faith. Time after time, he chose the Sabbath to demonstrate the kingdom, healing the sick, restoring the broken, uplifting the outcast. These weren't acts of rebellion. They were revelations. They showed us what the Sabbath was really for, to bring life where death had crept in, to bring rest where unrest had taken root. The religious leaders of his day were blinded by their obsession with rules. They had built fences around the Sabbath, not to protect it, but to control it. And in their pursuit of control, they had lost the core of its purpose. So when Jesus healed on the Sabbath, they saw a violation. But what God saw was restoration. What man called rebellion, heaven called righteousness. Jesus was not dismissing the Sabbath. He was delivering it back into its rightful place. He wasn't contradicting the law. He was clarifying its heart. Because the heart of the Sabbath was never about doing less, it was always about receiving more from God. The miracles Jesus performed on the Sabbath weren't incidental, they were intentional. He chose those moments to make a statement that would echo through time, that healing and wholeness are not bound by calendars or customs, that the goodness of God doesn't take a day off, that when people encounter the presence of Jesus, every day becomes holy. The man at the pool of Bethesda, lying paralyzed for 38 years, what better day to rise than the Sabbath? What better moment to step into freedom than the day ordained for rest and recovery? That miracle wasn't an accident. It was a message that rest isn't found in a ritual. It's found in a relationship. When Jesus declared himself Lord of the Sabbath, it wasn't a declaration of dominion in the way humans think of power. It was a declaration of design. He was saying, I am the originator of this rest. I'm not subject to the Sabbath. I'm the source of it. That kind of authority didn't abolish the day. It authenticated it. It confirmed that the Sabbath is more relevant than ever, not just as a day off, but as a spiritual principle. In Jesus, we don't escape the need for Sabbath. We enter into the fullness of it, because in him we find the true meaning of rest. Not just physical recovery, but spiritual restoration. The culture we live in idolizes hustle. It praises burnout as a badge of honor. People push past their limits, striving to achieve, perform, and prove their worth. But the Sabbath cuts against that current. It says, stop. Not because you're done, but because he's enough. It teaches us that our value doesn't come from what we produce, but from who we belong to. It invites us to rest not when we're finished, but because he finished it. That's why it's not just a break, it's a breakthrough. It's a space where trust is built, where clarity returns, and where we remember that we're not in control, but he is. Jesus used the Sabbath as a platform to shift perspectives. He confronted the mindset that equated rule keeping with righteousness and replaced it with something far greater. Relational obedience rooted in love and revelation. He showed us that the Sabbath is not just about stopping activity, it's about starting alignment. It's about coming back into sync with heaven's flow. It's about laying down burdens we were never meant to carry and picking up peace that the world cannot give. And in a world that's moving faster than ever, the Sabbath becomes our secret weapon. Not a limitation, but a liberation. Not a disruption, but a divine invitation. When we observe the Sabbath, not from a place of religious duty, but from spiritual hunger, everything changes. It becomes the most powerful day of our week. It becomes the altar where we lay down our anxiety and pick up his assurance. It becomes the well where our dry places are refreshed. It becomes the sanctuary where the noise of the world is silenced and the voice of God becomes clear again. That's why Jesus didn't discard the Sabbath. He restored it. He reminded us that we were never created to run endlessly. We were created to run to him, to rest in him, and to rise again, renewed by his presence. The conversation around whether Jesus abolished the Sabbath often arises from a misunderstanding, not just of Scripture, but of the very nature of who Jesus is and what he came to accomplish. To suggest that Jesus came to nullify the Sabbath is to misunderstand the character of God and the purpose of divine rest. The Sabbath was never simply about cessation from labor. It was a prophetic rhythm, a divine pattern woven into creation itself. When God rested on the seventh day, it wasn't because he was tired. It was because he was satisfied. The work was finished, and the rest that followed was a celebration of completion. This rhythm of work and rest was not just for God's benefit. It was designed for man's blessing. When Jesus walked in this world, he never diminished the weight or the value of the commandments. In fact, he magnified their purpose. He didn't come to erase the law, but to fulfill it, to live it in its truest and most complete form. When he healed on the Sabbath, he wasn't discarding the commandment. He was unveiling the deeper reality that the Sabbath was always pointing toward. The Sabbath was never meant to be a burden. It was meant to be a blessing. And Jesus, as the embodiment of grace and truth, showed us that it is not unlawful to do good on the Sabbath. In fact, doing good on the Sabbath is a return to its original intent, to restore what has been broken and to give space for divine intervention. The Pharisees had reduced the Sabbath to a checklist of prohibitions, robbing it of its soul. They missed the heart of God while clinging tightly to the hand of tradition. They believed that healing was a violation of Sabbath law, but Jesus exposed their error by revealing that true Sabbath keeping is not about inactivity, it's about alignment. Every miracle he performed on the Sabbath was intentional. It was a holy confrontation between legalism and liberty. Jesus showed that love doesn't pause on the seventh day. A network error occurred. Please check your connection and try again. If this issue persists, please contact us through our help center at help.openeye.com. Retreat